Virginians were sold a bill of goods. They were told that a map that would hand Democrats 10 of Virginia's 11 seats in Congress was fairness. The people who will have to live with the consequences of this map saw it for what it was on Tuesday, and they turned out and they fought against it. And they were almost enough. But the dark money from out of state, the activist interest groups, and the D.C. politicians barely dragged this amendment over the line. And now this fight moves from the ballot box to the courthouse. But before the courts decide it, Virginians deserve to know exactly what was done to get this scheme on the ballot before them this past Tuesday. In 2020, we as Virginians voted to get rid of the redistricting business, to take it away from politicians, and to end gerrymandering in Virginia. And in 2021, the Supreme Court of Virginia approved maps drawn in an apolitical and nonpartisan way. Those maps gave Virginia what Virginia actually is, a fairly closely divided state with divided representation. But the governor wanted a map that would hand her party 10 of Virginia's 11 seats in Congress. And she couldn't make that case to the voters straight up and honestly. So they rigged the process that went before the voters. And let's start with the special session. It was supposed to be about the budget, but they stretched it out for nearly 2 years and then used it to push a constitutional amendment on this gerrymandering. That was unlawful. And the trial court held that that process was void from the very start. Let's look at the timing of this scheme. By the time they pushed this amendment through in October of 2025, early voting had already started and more than 1 million Virginians had already voted. The Constitution requires an intervening general election between the first legislative passage of an amendment and the second. And the trial court held that the next valid election to actually proceed with this process is not until 2027. You don't change the rules after the game has already started. If you did that in sports, it's called cheating. If you did it in business, it's called fraud. And when politicians do it, it's a rigged process. Then look at the notice requirement. Virginia law very clearly requires that this amendment had to be posted and published months before any election could take place. They didn't do it. And when they got caught, they didn't pull the scheme back. They tried to rewrite the law in the middle of session to cover their tracks. And that tells you everything about this process. And finally, look at the ballot language. They didn't level with voters about what this really was. They didn't say, we want a map that gives Democrats 10 of Virginia's 11 seats in Congress. They didn't say, we want a gerrymander again. They wrapped a partisan gerrymander in the language of fairness and hoped that enough people wouldn't notice. And just yesterday, the trial court held that that ballot language was misleading and the April 21st votes were ineffective. Madam President, this whole process was rigged from the start. The special session was rigged, the timing was rigged, the notice was rigged, the ballot language was rigged. And the governor jammed it through anyway. And the closeness of this vote on Tuesday really proves the point. A vote this close is not a green light to give one party 10 of Virginia's 11 congressional seats. If that outcome were really fair, the ballot language would not have needed to have been misleading. It would not have needed to have required a hijacked special session. It would not need to be jammed through after early voting had already begun. A measure that barely passes is not a mandate to leave millions of Virginians with 1 out of 11 seats in Congress. And I want to say one word directly to the Supreme Court of Virginia. This case is now before you. You're not being asked to help Republicans and you're not being asked to help Democrats. You're being asked a simpler question than that. Does the Constitution of Virginia still mean what it says? Does it still bind the people who are in power And does it still protect the rights of the people who are out of power? Or can a governor and her party break every single safeguard in the amendment process, get caught doing it, and still claim legitimacy because they won by a sliver? If that's allowed, then nearly half the Commonwealth gets reduced to a token voice in Congress. If that's allowed, then Virginia is not being governed by the rule of law. It's being governed by a majority party led by a governor that thinks it can run a rigged scheme and get away with it. The Supreme Court now has a choice. It can enforce the Constitution, or it can teach every future majority in Virginia that if you move fast enough, if you hide the ball long enough, and if you mislead voters well enough, the rule of law doesn't matter. And I still believe that there are judges in this Commonwealth who know the difference between the rule of law and power. And for the sake of Virginia, our Supreme Court needs to show it. Thank you, Madam President.